You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. Today, our studio discussion is about the Scottish Government's decision to launch a consultation on reducing the drink driving limit. The current limit of 80 milligrams of alcohol per 100 millilitres of blood is already higher than the European standard of just 50 milligrams and has remained unchanged since 1966. Britain has the highest alcohol level tolerance in the world. But road safety campaigners are calling for a zero-tolerance approach. The current limit is roughly equivalent to 1.5 pints of beer. The change means drivers would be over the limit if they consume 1 pint of strong beer or a single large glass of wine. The British Medical Association say drivers at the current alcohol limit are 10 times more likely to crash than someone who has consumed none. A 50 milligram rule would make drivers only twice as likely to crash. But even this amount will impair their judgment of distance and speed. Joining me for today's discussion is Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drinking and Driving. Kevin Delaney is the head of road safety at the Institute of Advanced Motorists. Joining us on the phone is Jeanette Miller, the CEO of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers. On the line from Moscow, we have Alexei Sharapov, a drink driving expert from the motoring magazine Top Gear Russia. Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drinking and Driving. Are we too lenient on drink driving?
I think we are, but whatever new legislation is brought in must be introduced carefully. It's no good frightening the motorists and building up a wall of resentment. So you've got to lead motorists gently into whatever road driving improvement schemes you can. Road deaths are very expensive. Each one costs well over £1 million to the nation, and really drink driving already carries the death sentence.
And Kevin Delaney, head of road safety at the Institute of Advanced Motorists.
No, I don't think we are too lenient with drivers in general. The leniency, of course, comes when the drivers are actually in front of a court being dealt with by a judge, having been convicted. And yes, sometimes the sentences can seem very lenient. On other occasions, they can seem quite harsh, especially for somebody who is, over the limit, but only by a very small amount. Because in the UK, we don't. There is very little discretion about this. If you're driving with more than 80 milligrams % alcohol in your body, then you will be disqualified for 12 months. It doesn't matter whether it's 81. It doesn't matter if you've got a full-time job and you've a family depending upon you or anything like that. There are no mitigating circumstances generally, and you will be disqualified. On the other hand, at the higher end of the thing, where people have clearly had no regard whatsoever to the limit, sometimes the sentences can seem a little lenient.
Jeanette Miller, the CEO of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers.
Hi, yes, I'm just picking up on the point that Kevin made just then. I think we are not too lenient, but I think there is room for a lot more creativity and imagination when it comes to penalties. The point that Kevin was just making about there being no discretion whatsoever, if you're over the limit, then it's an automatic, mandatory minimum 12-month ban in the UK. Now, in other countries, particularly across Europe, they have a number of other penalty options, particularly with different classes of driver. So, for example, in Germany, there is zero tolerance for a learner driver or a driver between the age of 18 and 21, or a newly qualified driver, somebody who's passed their test within the last 2 years. So if they are caught with any alcohol whatsoever in their system, then that's when they face prosecution. Whereas in this country, there isn't any distinction between learner drivers and somebody who's been on the road for a long time. And I think that may well be worth looking at. And again, in America, they have a number of different penalty systems across the various states where they have a disqualification that applies to certain hours of the day, which would enable somebody to continue to drive to work, for example. And I think that's worth looking at, rather than just simply making it a zero-tolerance policy in the UK, being a bit more creative on the penalty system.
Alexei Sharapov, driving expert from the motoring magazine Top Gear Russia. As an outside onlooker into the UK, Russia obviously has a zero-tolerance limit. Do you think the UK is far too lenient on drink driving?
It's hard to say, because as strange as it may sound, drinking is a part of your culture. And, it is in Russia too, but we've had the zero-tolerance law for 2 years now, and I don't think it has done any significant changes or contributed to any changes in statistics and data. As for death because of drink driving, it just has increased the amount of bribes that you're supposed to pay if you get caught. Well, and I guess it should be totally different in England, as a more civilized country, I think.
If we go back to something that Jeanette Miller brought up, she suggested that learners and newly qualified drivers should have a lower limit, perhaps. This is something, Kevin Delaney from the Institute of Advanced Motorists, that we should begin to explore.
Yes, I mean, there are, I think, a number of what could be called high-risk groups within there. And certainly young people, learner drivers, those who've recently qualified, fall into a high-risk group anyway. They are the ones who, even without alcohol, are grossly overrepresented in the crash and casualty statistics. And, of course, being younger and having less experience of alcohol and perhaps less self-restraint, they tend to be the ones who are more affected by the alcohol they drink anyway. So, yes, perhaps if we're going to have some sort of more imaginative approach, and that may be the way to go forward, this would certainly be would be a good way of doing it, so that young people, recently qualified drivers, would have a lower limit. Perhaps professional drivers should have a lower limit as well. Where people are driving for a living, or especially where they are perhaps driving passengers for a living, then yes, a much lower limit would undoubtedly be appropriate.
Tony Dring, the former chairman of the Campaign Against Drink Driving, do you welcome this creativity, perhaps exploring a lower limit for professional drivers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, but also the newly qualified?
I welcome it with open arms. We've got to remember that alcohol is just one of many psychotropic drugs that are available to particularly young motorists. And I know a number of young motorists who would not dream of getting behind the wheel if they've had a drink, but think nothing of having one of any cocktail of tablets and potions that they can buy illegally, and nobody knows the effect they have on their driving ability. Coincidentally, my next door neighbour yesterday, he's just got back from a long tour of Europe in his motor caravan, and because it weighs more than 3.5 tons, in some countries he was subjected to a 0 alcohol level because it was a larger vehicle. Whereas if it'd been a motor car, then a 50 milligram limit would have applied. So, there is scope, obviously, particularly in the light of today's tragic news of a coach crashing in the south of England. Although we don't know the circumstances, I'm no doubt that the driver will be closely monitored as to what his state was.
But surely alcohol affects at any level.
I think if you were to suddenly impose a zero tolerance level in this country, there are a number of considerations that would cause problems, not the least of which drivers not being able to make the jump from 80 milligrams per 100 millilitres all the way down to 0. And I think perhaps a 50 milligram for a few years would properly enforced would be a good idea, and then perhaps down to 20, and that's probably the lowest practical level that you can have, because the body, as we all know, manufactures alcohol to metabolise food, and also auntie's glass of sherry from the night before might just be lingering. So Yeah, perhaps 20 milligrams per 100 millilitres. That's the one that's imposed for pilots in this country and within the European Union. Not a bad limit to perhaps to aim for, but not all in one go. I don't think that the British motorist would accept this massive jump, and I can't see that the police have the resources to enforce it.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the drink driving limit. Joining me is Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drinking and Driving. Kevin Delaney is the head of road safety at the Institute of Advanced Motorists. Joining us on the phone is Jeanette Miller, the CEO of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers. On the line from Moscow, we have Alexei Sharapov, a drink driving expert from the motoring magazine Top Gear Russia. Jeanette Miller, the CEO of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers. A zero-tolerance approach, Tony saying that the British motorists won't accept it, but is it just tough?
Well, I don't think the British motorist is going to be the decider here. I think there will be a major problem if the limit is reduced to zero, but I think there's also a problem if it's reduced to be in line with many of the European countries. We already have the highest level I think one of the highest levels in Europe, but we also have a bit of a problem with drink driving. I come across those who have been charged with the offence, and it is astounding how many people I speak to who at the very start of the conversation, pretty much the first words will be, I don't agree with drink driving, I'm not a drink driver. Well, in a lot of cases, they are a drink driver, but they didn't realise or they didn't have the knowledge to be able to make the judgment call. And I think that stems from a problem with the education of motorists and the understanding of how alcohol is dealt with in one's biological makeup. Many people just don't appreciate that you can't count units and then consider yourself to be under the limit. It doesn't work like that.
Let's bring in Kevin Delaney from the Institute of Advanced Motorists. Jeanette is saying that people are getting confused. Surely a best way to stop them from getting confused is saying no alcohol whatsoever.
Absolutely right. Let's be clear about this. If you want to make it painfully simple, then you say no alcohol whatsoever. However, there is a problem. Each and every time that the police actually stop somebody and deal with them for drink driving, it removes the police officer or officers from operational duties for the length of time it takes to deal with that person. And that could be several hours. While they're doing that, they are not out there, perhaps dealing with people who have drunk a great deal more. We have to remember that the problem with drink driving really exists with the if you like, the most vulnerable or the most dangerous groups. They may be young people, they may be people who habitually drink and drive, they may be people who have drunk far too much. And we're not talking here about a little over the present 80 limit. We're talking about people who could be 2, 3, 4 and sometimes even 5 times over the limit, surprising though that is to someone like me. The simple fact is they represent the greatest danger. They are the ones who need to be taken off the road. And the lower you make the limit, the less likely it is that there will be police officers around to deal with them, because the more likely it is they will be dealing with people who have transgressed the lower limit. They may well have had a crash, they have broken the law. But the simple fact is that whilst dealing with them, somebody who represents a far greater danger to the public, whose driving may be manifestly dreadful, escapes undetected because there is no one there to detect them. And this, I think, is what informs the IAM approach to all the proposals about reducing the drink drive limit. Fine if we have the resources to do it, but we don't have the resources, and the way things are going at the moment, we're going to have less resources rather than more, or even keeping the same.
If you do welcome a zero tolerance approach, but you're worried about resources, what kind of solution is the IAM putting forward for that?
Well, I think the IAM solution is, that there are issues out of our control. The solution would be let's have more policemen. Unfortunately, more policemen cost an awful lot of money. We don't have money in this country. So there aren't going to be more policemen. In fact, there are going to be less policemen. So, we have to live in the real world. Our view is that, that really education is probably the greatest single possible way of tackling this now. Even reducing from 80 to 50 will, we would love to see, to be able to support it and to see a significant reduction in casualties. But neither I nor the IAM believes that will necessarily happen, because we don't believe that the police will have the resources to devote to enforcement. If that does happen, then there is a danger, A, that the legislation doesn't deliver what's expected of it, and B, that the legislation itself becomes into disrepute. And if we ever arrive at the point where the British motorists, the English, Scottish and Welsh motorists, actually think, well, hey, I can drink and drive and get away with it, then we have a serious problem. Because at the moment, the legislation for, I would guess, 99% of the population is almost self-enforcing. And if it ceases to be self-enforcing, then I think we have a real problem on our hands, and we could see things get worse rather than better.
Alexei Sharapov, driving expert from the motoring magazine Top Gear Russia. You said how a zero-tolerance approach didn't work in Russia. Do you think lowering the limit, so from 80 milligrams to 50 milligrams, might have been a more sensible approach and a more effective approach?
Yes, I think so. Because in the real world, there are almost no people with zero alcohol in the body. So I think that zero tolerance is not a way out. Absolutely. Plus, we've had tests in our magazine several times even. Where we compared small amounts of alcohol drunk before driving and extreme fatigue state. And I should say that those who suffer from stress and extreme fatigue, they may at some point be more dangerous to in traffic than those people who drink a very small amount of alcohol before they drive. I know it may sound very strange to you, but still it is true. Yeah.
Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drink Driving. What Alexei says is quite key here. We could end up criminalising drivers who have remnants of alcohol. They might have gone, as you said before, to their aunties and had some of her brandy cake or any kind of liqueur, which could be left over from the night before or even from many hours before. Isn't this a risk?
When I was chairman of CAD, I campaigned long and hard to get morning after breathalyzers into the marketplace. And I know one major motor factor retailing chain did this, and with some considerable degree of success. Now marketing an electronic version, which is perhaps in the long term more cost effective for the motorist, but I do sometimes doubt its long-term accuracy. The police one costs, the roadside non-evidential breath tester costs about £1,000, needs recalibrating every 6 months. This thing costs about £70 and will go on ad infinitum, and they claim to still be accurate. I would hope it is, but I would also hope that nobody trusts it too much.
Jeanette Miller, what are your thoughts on the zero tolerance approach and the benefits of it?
There is a problem if you have a much lower limit, then the police are going to be tied up dealing with very low-level offenders rather than apprehending those who pose a much more serious threat to the motorists and pedestrians out there. But the problem is compacted by a further issue with a reduced spend on education, where we already have an education problem. And then if you're going to reduce the limit where people are already suffering with quite a lot of confusion of the system, then you're going to have a lot of otherwise law-abiding motorists out there who are apprehended and possibly convicted of a really serious offence. A drink drive offence is not just like a speeding matter, which also has its seriousness attached to it, but it's classed as a criminal conviction, and it has a lot of further ramifications attached to it, not just the disqualification.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the drink driving limit. Joining me is Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drinking and Driving. Kevin Delaney is the head of road safety at the Institute of Advanced Motorists. Joining us on the phone is Jeanette Miller, the CEO of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers. On the line from Moscow, we have Alexei Sharapov, a drink driving expert from the motoring magazine Top Gear Russia. Kevin Delaney from the Institute of Advanced Motorists. Let's explore this possibility of ploughing more money into education. There is confusion among motorists. 80 milligrams of alcohol per 100 millilitres of blood. How can the public translate that? Is that how education could solve it?
I don't know that education on its own will solve it. I mean, let's be clear about this. You know, I think there are elements here of education. We can do more enforcement. I mean, I having said that we don't have a lot of policemen and they're going to get less, the ones we have could do an awful lot more. So I think what we should look at what is available. Yes, we can do more about education. Anybody who tries to predict the amount of alcohol they've got in their body, especially at the time they're drinking it, is wasting their time. The simple fact is that, you know, that alcohol is absorbed into your body at different rates and goes on being absorbed into your body potentially a long time after you have finished drinking. While Tony is right, you know, the morning after breathalyzer has a lot to commend it, but spending an evening drinking and then taking a breath test before you go home is not going to give you a reliable indicator, because your alcohol could actually rise considerably after you've started the journey. So, you know, yes, we do need, we need more education, and the education we should be doing is a very simple message: do not drink and drive. The second element, I think, is one of deterrent. The law itself is not that great a deterrent. Certainly not for those who either don't think it applies to them, or who are not thinking logically, usually after they've had about their second or third drink. I think, you know, what we need to be doing is, you know, the police need to spend less time making excuses for not getting out there and enforcing it proactively, and more time doing it. 20, 30 years ago, if you drove around the streets of any city in the United Kingdom, you would see somebody being stopped and being breathalyzed by a police officer. I haven't seen that happen now at all in the last 10 years. And the final thing, of course, is that engineering, if you like, has a part to play. There are devices on the market called alcohol interlocks that could be built into every single new vehicle that rolls off the production line. And whilst they're not perfect, and whilst they can be avoided, the simple fact is that for most drivers, if you couldn't start your car because you'd had too much to drink, you would make sure that you didn't have anything to drink at all. So I think there are things we can do. And I do stress at this stage that these are the views of Kevin Delaney rather than the Institute of Advanced Motorists. You know, as an ex-policeman, I believe that there is an easy solution to everything, and it usually involves policemen doing more work.
Tony Dring, let's explore what Kevin Delaney said about harsher penalties, perhaps. Do you think harsher penalties might be the easier solution here?
Perhaps part of the answer, and I only say part of the answer, lies in what is now being introduced in some forces, which is a roadside evidential breath testing device. So once you are tested at the roadside, that becomes your evidential reading. You're bang to rights from that moment on. Also, I would very much like to see the ban start then and there. I would also like to see more use of the court's ability to seize and, if necessary, destroy the motor vehicle of somebody who is particularly a repeat offender. There are so many more things that we could do without really changing the law fundamentally.
But do harsher penalties send a stronger message?
I think if you threaten to take somebody's toys away from them, that is really going to be a harsh message, and you'll find the average red-blooded bloke will start to whimper quite significantly then and there. I think, considering that 14 years is the maximum that you can get for killing somebody in a drink-drive crash, how much more do you want it to go? Sadly, the courts don't see it that way, and you'll find that Crown Courts will not hand down a penalty that is that strict, and it will, if they do hand down a serious penalty, it will almost always be reduced on appeal, because the appeal court judges seem to have a mindset that about 3 years is in prison is about right for a human life.
Jeanette Miller from the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers, based on what we've just heard from Tony Dring, do we need to send a stronger message to judges, perhaps issue guidance on the maximum sentences they should be dishing out rather than the lenient ones that we've just heard from Tony?
Whilst I'm sure with the best intentions, and he doesn't believe that introducing an immediate ban, the seizure and destruction of a motor vehicle and a roadside evidential breath test would change the law fundamentally, as he put it. It simply would. It's effectively allowing the police to become the judge and dish out the penalty, which I think is full of potential flaws and injustice for those people who actually are innocent. And I do come across quite a few who have been breathalyzed at the police station, or there's been a blood sample or urine sample collected from them, and there is some flaw in the device used or in the method of analysis used if it's a urine or blood sample. But going back to the sentences that are imposed in the very serious fatal cases, I can't imagine what it must feel like to be a family member of a victim, and yet any penalty that's going to be imposed in that situation will probably never feel like it's long enough. So I'm not sure that...
But 3 years definitely won't seem long enough, will it?
It would just be a complete and utter insult to somebody who's lost a relative. That no level of penalty is going to make that situation feel any better.
Kevin Delaney, should we start changing these guidelines to judges then?
I think there are two things that we need to look at. First and foremost, the law as it currently stands. We're talking about reducing the drink drive limit. To the best of my knowledge and belief, there is no hard and fast research about the number of drivers who are involved in crashes, especially injury crashes, where their blood alcohol limit is below the present 80. So if reduced from 80 to 50, how many more casualties will we actually save? I know that some academic work has been done, which comes up with all sorts of estimates. But we have the ability to actually sort of do some hard and fast research, which we appear not to have done. So we're talking about reducing the drink drive limit on the basis of almost hypothesis. Secondly, we do have powers. The courts have powers to seize drivers' vehicles now. Drinking and driving is a serious criminal offence as defined. It's the same as theft. It's the same as violence. And in exactly the same way that a serial shoplifter or a bank robber's vehicle can be seized, so a drink driver's vehicle can be seized. These penalties, these powers are not used sufficiently. And then, yes, perhaps we do need to be, sort of tightening up perhaps the guidance to courts and especially judges who are dealing with the sentencing about what is an appropriate level.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you to all of my guests: Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drinking and Driving; Kevin Delaney at the Institute of Advanced Motorists; Jeanette Miller of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers; Alexei Sharapov from the motoring magazine Top Gear Russia. To 1.5 pints of beer. The change means drivers would be over the limit if they consume 1 pint of strong beer or a single large glass of wine. The British Medical Association say drivers at the current alcohol limit are 10 times more likely to crash than someone who has consumed none. A 50 milligram rule would make drivers only twice as likely to crash. But even this amount will impair their judgment of distance and speed. Joining me for today's discussion is Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drinking and Driving. Kevin Delaney is the head of road safety at the Institute of Advanced Motorists. Joining us on the phone is Jeanette Miller, the CEO of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers. On the line from Moscow, we have Alexei Sharapov, a drink driving expert from the motoring magazine Top Gear Russia. Tony Dring, former chairman of the Campaign Against Drinking and Driving. Are we too lenient on drink driving?
I think we are, but whatever new legislation is brought in must be introduced carefully. It's no good frightening the motorists and building up a wall of resentment. So you've got to lead motorists gently into whatever road driving improvement schemes you can. Road deaths are very expensive. Each one costs well over £1 million to the nation, and really drink driving already carries the death sentence.
And Kevin Delaney, Head of Road Safety at the Institute of Advanced Motorists.
And at the higher end of the thing, where people have clearly had no regard whatsoever to the limit, sometimes the sentences can seem a little lenient.
Jeanette Miller, the CEO of the Association of Motor Offence Lawyers.
Hi, yes, I'm just picking up on the point that Kevin made just then. I think we are not too lenient, but I think there is room for a lot more creativity and imagination when it comes to penalties. The point that Kevin was just making about there being no discretion whatsoever, if you're over the limit, then it's an automatic, mandatory minimum 12-month ban in the UK. Now, in other countries, particularly across Europe, they have a number of other penalty options, particularly with different classes of driver. So, for example, in Germany, there is zero tolerance for a learner driver or a driver between the ages.
No, I don't think we are too lenient with drivers in general. The leniency, of course, comes when the drivers are actually in front of a court being dealt with by a judge, having been convicted. And yes, sometimes the sentences can seem very lenient. On other occasions, they can seem quite harsh, especially for somebody who is, over the limit, but only by a very small amount. Because in the UK, we don't. There is very little discretion about this. If you're driving with more than 80 milligrams% alcohol in your body, then you will be disqualified for 12 months. It doesn't matter whether it's 81. It doesn't matter if you've got a full-time job and you've a family depending upon you or anything like that. There are no mitigating circumstances generally, and you will be disqualified. On the other hand,
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. Today, our studio discussion is about the Scottish Government's decision to launch a consultation on reducing the drink driving limit. The current limit of 80 milligrams of alcohol per 100 millilitres of blood is already higher than the European standard of just 50 milligrams and has remained unchanged since 1966. Britain has the highest alcohol level tolerance in the world, but road safety campaigners are calling for a zero tolerance approach. The current limit is roughly equivalent